Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Strauss. I teach Jewish Studies and Israel Studies at American University. And welcome to the third webinar in our fall 2024 series, Antisemitism, a Political Tradition. And that consists of 6 talks. And so now after we hear today's, we'll be at the halfway mark. And these 6 talks highlight the work and perspectives of our own faculty and alumni. Today, we're hearing from Dr. Julie Keresztes, who will speak on anti-Semitism in times of crisis, the case of Hitler's photographer. Just a reminder that we are recording all of these lectures and that our first 2 lectures in the series by Professors Michael Brenner and Pamela Nadel are already up on our website. This series is co-sponsored by AU's Jewish Studies program and the Meltzer Schwartzberg Center for Israel Studies, also at American University. We thank the Center for Israel Studies Managing Director, Laura Cutler, for all she does to advertise and otherwise help these programs to run smoothly. We also want to welcome our audience, now tuning in from around the globe, thanks to the magic of Zoom, which includes friends of the university and of both the Jewish Studies program and the Center for Israel Studies, as well as AU alumni, academic colleagues from many institutions, and of course, most importantly, our own students. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Julie Keresztes is an historian of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. She is the 2022 to 25 postdoctoral fellow at American University and at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So the Holocaust Museum and AU are fortunate to share Julie. So this is the 3rd year that we have had the pleasure of her presence at AU and her excellent teaching. Her first book, entitled Photography and the Making of the Nazi Racial Community, will be published by Cornell University Press in January of 2025, and we're all really excited for that. Dr. Keresztes, thank you so much for being here. We're all really looking forward to hearing about your research.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that introduction and for hosting this very important series. And thank you as well to Laura Cutler and the other organizers for putting this series together. And thank you to all of you for joining me today. So in the 2 previous talks that opened this series, Professor Michael Brenner and Professor Pamela Nadel explored the long and global history of anti-Semitism. They talked about what anti-Semitism is and how it evolved from religious anti-Judaism to its more modern form as racial and political anti-Semitism. They also discuss the common stereotypes and prejudices that have historically underwritten it and continue to do so today. In this talk, I want to discuss how this long tradition of anti-Semitism has been both deployed during and shaped by moments of crisis. Historians and other scholars have long explored the relationship between crisis and anti-Semitism, noting that anti-Semitism escalates during periods of upheaval. In their 1991 edited volume on the subject, for example, the historian Xander Gilman and the philosopher Stephen Katz noted that negative stereotypes about Jews are resuscitated and repurposed in times of crisis, and that this contributes to the staying power of anti-Semitism in general. Historically, Jews have been blamed for war, revolution, economic recessions and depressions, natural disasters, and disease. And unfortunately, history offers plenty of examples of this. German history is especially instructive, and not only because there are so many examples to engage with. It is also instructive because the stakes of that relationship between crisis and anti-Semitism are particularly clear. given how Germany's own history of anti-Semitism would culminate in Nazism and the Holocaust. How it could be that so many Germans would embrace the ideas and goals of Hitler and the Nazi Party remains a central question for scholars. Today, I want to take up that question by talking to you about a particular moment of crisis in German history that played a crucial role in strengthening anti-Semitism well before the Nazis' rise to power in the 1930s. And I want to do so using a biographical approach. I'd like to focus on the radicalizing effects of this moment on one person in particular, the photographer Heinrich Hoffmann. Even if you don't think you do, you know Heinrich Hoffmann. Hoffmann was the personal photographer, friend, and confidant of Adolf Hitler, and created the now iconic images of the dictator, other top Nazis, as well as Nazi rallies, marches, and parades that have by now become extremely familiar. I am currently writing a biography of Hoffmann, in part to explore how and why he became a Nazi. And one thing that's particularly striking about this is how quickly Hoffmann did so. Other Nazi personalities that might be more familiar to you did not join the Nazi Party until later on in the 1920s. Joseph Goebbels, for instance, joined the Nazi Party in 1924. Hermann Goering joined in 1922. And Heinrich Himmler joined in 1923. But Heinrich Hoffmann joined earlier than any of them, on April 6th, 1920. And to explain why, we have to go back in time a bit. During the German Empire, Hoffmann was a professional portrait photographer who operated his own studio in the Bavarian city of Munich as of 1910. In many ways, this period was the heyday of professional portrait photography, and Hoffmann became a successful businessman, if a largely unknown one, outside of Munich. I have not found any evidence to suggest that Hoffmann engaged in political activity or held any anti-Semitic beliefs during this period. The catastrophe of World War I, however, would change that. Hoffmann spent most of the war years as a press photographer on the home front. His photographs from 1914, some of which you see here, captured the initial spirit of enthusiasm for war in Munich that would quickly dissipate as the tide turned away from a German victory in the years to come. In 1917, Hoffmann was called up for service in France with a unit of the Bavarian Flying Reserve Section, one of a series of air units that had been created that year to train and provide replacement pilots, mechanics, and intelligence to support the German army. Hoffmann's job was to develop and classify aerial reconnaissance photos. He described the job in his memoirs as, quote, not a very warlike occupation, but a very important one, end quote. He was scheduled to join an active combat unit in October 1918, but that never happened. Instead, revolution and defeat happened first. And both were central for Hoffmann's embrace of the anti-Semitic right wing. Revolution was not unique to Germany during this period. For World War I had helped dismantle several empires even before it officially ended. Take the case of Russia, for example, in the year 1917. The popular uprising of February 1917 had deposed the Tsar and ended the Russian monarchy, fueled by the ravages and privation that the war had caused. And a few months later, in October, the far-left Russian Bolsheviks would seize power, resulting in a bloody civil war that would last for years. The Russian case terrified Germans as revolution arrived in Germany too. It began in October 1918. By then, Germany's defeat was clear. And yet, with the armistice all but finalized, Sailors in the northern German naval port of Kiel were ordered by their officers to carry out one last operation against British forces, which they knew would be a suicide mission. The sailors were outraged by this order. They mutinied and refused to follow that order. Instead, they left their posts and spread revolution as well as labor strikes as they traveled home by railway. The revolution spread throughout Germany, and participants seized military and civil powers in individual cities as regional princes and royal leaders willingly abdicated without much protest. Sailors, soldiers, and workers also began to elect workers and soldiers' councils modeled after the Russian Revolution. That is exactly what happened in the German state of Bavaria, to take just one example of how the revolution unfolded locally. It would become particularly chaotic and last for a uniquely long time in the city of Munich, where Hoffmann lived and worked. On November 7th, 1918, a small group of left-wing oppositionists led by Kurt Eisner managed to overthrow the Bavarian King Ludwig III in Munich. Eisner became minister-president of the proclaimed People's State of Bavaria. Eisner was a member of the Independent Social Democratic Party, a splinter party that had broken away from the established Social Democratic Party in 1917 to protest the party's support of the war effort. This splitting of the left would become even more pronounced in December of 1918, when the more radical left-wing German Communist Party was founded. The declared aims of the new government led by Kurt Eisner were twofold. One was the immediate end to the war, and the other was the transformation of the state into a parliamentary democracy. The success in overthrowing the Bavarian monarchy was all the more astonishing because it had been achieved without serious resistance and without any bloodshed, unlike the Russian case. 2 days later, the revolution achieved national proportions. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne, bringing both the German Empire and the German monarchy to an end. In the capital of Berlin, governing powers were transferred to Friedrich Ebert, a social democrat, who then formed a provisional government and established Germany as a republic. Germany's defeat in World War I was also sealed at this time when an official armistice was signed on November 11th. Germany's defeat had numerous consequences. One was the widespread sense of shock and humiliation and anger, emotions that were made even worse by the popular perception among Germans that the Treaty of Versailles had been excessively punitive. There were also economic difficulties. War reparations had taken their toll, and the war created as well a substantial amount of inflation, not quite at the level of the 1923 hyperinflation, but still serious nonetheless. Hoffmann was particularly affected by this last point, the economic consequences of the war, for in his memoirs, he allegedly sold his studio amid serious financial difficulties. But he would be even more affected by the political situation in Munich, which quickly worsened as well. The initial political consensus that had made the overthrow of the Bavarian monarchy possible was soon destroyed as political divisions fostered competing visions of who should govern and how that ideal government should look. This mainly became clear through competition between the extreme left, which aimed at pure council rule, and the militant right, which worked toward the restoration of an authoritarian nation state. These tensions and political divisions culminated in the murder of Kurt Eisner by a right-wing nationalist aristocrat on February 21st, 1919. In fact, Eisner was on his way to resign from his position as minister president, for his party, the Independent Social Democrats, had been defeated in the recent January elections. His assassination ushered in a new second phase of revolution, this one marked by deepening political division and more vigorous, violent jostling for power. Eisner was succeeded by Johannes Hoffmann, a leader in the German Social Democratic Party, and Hoffmann was elected the new minister president in March 1919. But the chaos triggered by Eisner's murder provided the opportunity for others to swoop in and seize the opportunity to resolve what they viewed as a significant power vacuum. On April 7th, 1919, a group of anarchists aligned with the Independent Social Democrats seized power and declared a Soviet-style republic, now known as the First Council Republic. They were far less willing than Eisner had been to work with the established Social Democratic Party to stabilize and secure Bavaria. Scared for their safety, the newly elected Social Democratic leaders and parliamentary representatives fled to the town of Bamberg. But this initial seizure of power was not the end of things. Only 6 days later, a group of communist revolutionaries ousted the Independent Social Democrats, seized power for themselves, and declared the Second Council Republic on April 14th, 1919. At this point, the clash escalated into a full-on military confrontation. On one side, there was the communist forces and their soldiers in the newly established Red Army. And on the other side were troops loyal to the elected Social Democratic government, and which now consisted of members of the German Free Corps, a national voluntary paramilitary organization that largely consisted of demobilized soldiers and had already helped crush a communist uprising in Berlin that January. Eventually, the communist forces were defeated, and Social Democratic officials, as well as members of parliament, returned to Munich and to power in May 1919. By the following spring, however, it would become abundantly clear that it was actually the right wing that would emerge out of this conflict as the primary victor. And the political right was not the only thing to rise during this tumultuous period. Antisemitism spiked as well. It was driven by two older forms of antisemitism, namely the anti-Semitic tropes that Jews were disloyal citizens, and also that Jews plotted for global power and control. But the crisis of World War I and revolution had helped refashion these more traditional forms of anti-Semitism into a new variant. The conspiracy theory that communism was a Jewish plot to destroy and control the nations of Europe. According to the historian Paul Hannebrink in his recent book, A Spectre Haunting Europe, The Myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, this conspiracy theory had taken hold during the Russian Revolution and spread from there. It persists today as well in the toxic nationalism of resurgent right-wing politics. It was fueled, too, by additional, broader conspiracy theories circulating at the time. One was the so-called stab in the back legend, which was in circulation among nationalist and anti-Semitic circles near the end of World War I. And the legend held that Germany had not lost the war because it had been outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outmanned. Rather, adherents of the legend erroneously argued that Germany had lost the war because it had been sabotaged and betrayed, or stabbed in the back, by disloyal Jews and communists. A second contributing conspiracy theory took print form in the form of a text called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This was a fabricated text that had actually been plagiarized from earlier works of fiction, but it purported to document and detail a Jewish plot for global domination. It was first published in Russia in 1903, translated into multiple languages, and disseminated internationally, making its way to Germany following the Russian Revolution. But the new anti-Semitic conspiracy theory was facilitated by something else as well. The fact that some prominent revolutionary figures had Jewish ancestry. That included Leon Trotsky in Russia, for example, Rosa Luxemburg in Berlin, and it also included political figures in Munich too, including Kurt Eisner, who was Germany's first Jewish minister-president, Ernst Toller, a German Jewish playwright and writer who helped establish the First Council Republic, and also Eugen Leviné, a Russian Jewish revolutionary who helped establish the Second Council Republic. For more on these fascinating political figures, as well as the full extent of anti-Semitism during this period, I highly recommend Professor Michael Brenner's excellent book, In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution, and the Rise of Nazism. The fact that these political figures had Jewish heritage made it easy for conservative reactionaries to invoke the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that communism was a Jewish plot. It also emboldened them to blame all Jews in general for the upheaval, even though, as Professor Brenner notes in his book, Bavarian Jews largely did not support the revolution or communism. For German Jews, though, the outburst of anti-Semitism itself became a crisis. Jews were physically assaulted in the streets, and calls for their deportation, arrest, and even murder could be heard in public or read in the press. The Jewish German scholar Victor Klemperer, who is best known for his diaries chronicling Nazi Germany, also wrote about the Munich Revolution and the anti-Semitism he observed during it. He recalled, quote, "Anti-Semitism began to run rampant here, and the Jew became a convenient all-purpose enemy. During my entire time in Munich, I was never personally subjected to anti-Semitism, but I did feel depressed and isolated by it," end quote. Now, returning to Hoffmann, the role of the revolutionary period in radicalizing him is plain to see in a few different ways, and he was not alone in this. It was no accident that it was in Munich that Hitler himself established the Nazi movement and developed his own anti-Semitic worldview. But the influence of these events on Hoffmann is first of all evident in his political activity. In late 1918, Hoffmann came into contact with far-right anti-Semitic and nationalist circles. He met and befriended, for example, the right-wing nationalist and anti-Semite Dietrich Eckart. Eckart would found the German Workers' Party in 1919, which would go on to become the Nazi Party under Hitler's leadership in February of 1920. It was also Eckart who personally introduced Hoffmann to Hitler in 1919 as well. By the summer of 1919, Hoffmann had also joined the Munich Citizens Defense League, a far-right civilian paramilitary league that had been created during this period to fight the left. Even though both council republics had by this point been decisively suppressed, The common view among Bavarian conservatives at the time was that a third might be possible and that communism remained a threat. As the historian David Clay Large has described it, the Citizens Defense League was one of the many paramilitary organizations to have proliferated in Germany during the post-World War I period, quote, like mushrooms after a rainstorm, end quote. The League would go on to become the dominant paramilitary force in Bavaria for the next 2 years. For its members, it functioned as a sort of halfway point between the more conservative, static politics of the old right wing to the more radical, violent politics of the new right wing. And in operating beyond the reach of state policing and military structures, it also helped undermine Weimar democracy itself, to the eventual benefit of the Nazi Party. The influence of the revolutionary period on Heinrich Hoffmann is also clear in his publications. From this point on, those publications take a decidedly right-wing political turn. One example is what can be viewed as his first work of visual propaganda, which he published himself in November 1919. That publication is a pamphlet entitled 1 Year of the Bavarian Revolution in Pictures. Note as well the white-blue diamond pattern on the cover. That pattern comes from the flag historically associated with the royal Wittelsbach family, which ruled Bavaria from 1180 to 1918. The first edition of this pamphlet consisted of 32 pages with 130 images as well as text. The images included in it consisted of several different types. One consisted of the photographs Hoffmann himself had made in the course of the revolutionary events. There were others as well that he included, others made by professional photographers apart from himself in Munich, including, above all, studio portraits of individual leaders and revolutionaries. One example is this famous portrait of Kurt Eisner here that was made by the woman communist photographer Germaine Kroll. The pamphlet also included documents and posters and letters that had been gathered by local collectors and given to Hoffmann himself. The first edition of the pamphlet sold around 10,000 copies, which Hoffmann priced at about 4 marks each. And he ran 2 additional editions of this pamphlet. One soon afterward, in January 1920. That copy sold about 20,000. And a third edition, which he released in 1937. In his posters advertising the pamphlet from 1919 to 1920, Hoffmann described it as, quote, a commemoration, not a celebration of the revolution. And these advertisements also declared that, quote, 130 illustrations and text provide a historical depiction of the people and events of the revolution, end quote. But if calling it a historical depiction implied accuracy, impartiality, or neutrality, it was far from that. In it, Hoffmann's new political sympathies were quite clear, for it was a strongly right-wing interpretation. For one thing, Hoffmann portrayed the forces who crushed the Council Republics as liberators. This was the dominant focus in Hoffmann's own photographs of the events, which he had created in the course of the suppression of the Second Council Republic. In his photographs, he focused in particular on celebrating photographically the paramilitary forces that he viewed as having freed Munich. One example is the photograph you see here of members of the local Free Corps Munich division marching through the streets. And in a further second example, Hoffmann shows the Berlin Free Corps after having helped defeat the Red Army. And you can see on their truck the well-known skull and bones insignia of the Free Corps, which would later be adapted by the Nazi SS to adorn the uniforms of concentration camp staff. In a third photograph, Hoffmann photographed the members of the Munich Citizens Defense League, in which he was a member, and he showed them in the process of arresting captured Red Army soldiers. No mention was made in the pamphlet of the up to 1,200 people murdered by the Free Corps as suspected communists. Instead, Hoffmann blamed any and all bloodshed or deaths on the revolutionaries themselves, who he accused in the pamphlet of instigating them. In addition to this strongly right-wing view of revolutionary events, the brochure was also incredibly strongly anti-Semitic. This was something that the Nazis themselves would celebrate years later in a newspaper article celebrating Hoffmann's 50th birthday. And as you can see here, that article celebrating Hoffmann's birthday appeared in the official Nazi paper, and in it, they described the pamphlet in the following terms. In 1918, it reads, Hoffmann met Dietrich Eckart in Munich, who personally introduced him to Adolf Hitler in 1919. From this point on, Hoffmann has been continuously in the service of the movement. Back then in 1919, he was one of the first to publish an anti-Semitic pamphlet, a risk taken at the time that promised neither business nor other advantages. Here, the Nazis celebrated this 1919 pamphlet as evidence of Hoffmann's commitment to the Nazi Party and as evidence of him having done so for no other reason than his genuine belief and devotion to an anti-Semitic cause. As so many others did and would do in the years to come, rather than look to the complex socio-political and economic structures that made the revolution possible, Hoffmann instead invoked the easy and available explanations that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories provided for him. In the pamphlet, he portrayed revolution as a Jewish plot to undermine the German nation. Further, he did not distinguish between the November 1918 revolution or the two April 1919 Council Republics. And he specifically blamed Kurt Eisner for all of it, despite the fact that Eisner had been assassinated before either of those two Council Republics ever came to be. Here, I'll quote the pamphlet. Quote, "It can be stated as a fundamental principle. If Eisner, the man who made the revolution, had not been a Jew, the German Revolution would have taken a different path. A path that might have quickly led us out of our misery and back to the top," end quote. Hoffmann also invoked the anti-Semitic trope of Jews as a race who were disloyal to Germany and could never be Germans themselves. Again, I quote him, and again, Hoffmann refers to Eisner here. Quote, "Would a German by blood have been capable of such a Judaic act?" End quote. Finally, Hoffmann also strongly suggested that the connection between Jews and communism could be detected by sight based on how they looked. I'll quote him again. What we read and hear about a person has a different effect when we can imagine their appearance. What they did becomes clearer when we know what they looked like. And many who pick up the book will remember, oh, that's him. I saw him every day on the tram. He was sitting in the restaurant. He lived on our street, end quote. This remark served to threaten Germans that racial and therefore political enemies were among them, and purposefully cultivated a certain paranoia about the possibility of another uprising from the left, and additionally conflated Jews with that potential uprising. And as we all know, the idea that Jews could be identified by how they looked would go on to shape Nazi propaganda throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. A further display of far right-wing anti-Semitism is evident at the very end of the pamphlet. There, one can see a full-page advertisement for a newspaper, Auf gut Deutsch, or in plain German. This was Hoffmann's friend Dietrich Eckart's militantly right-wing and anti-Semitic newspaper, which routinely blamed Jews for everything from defeat to revolution to inflation and more. And it also featured anti-Semitic caricatures of Eisner as well as other political figures from the revolutionary year. Hoffmann would himself assist Eckart in publishing this newspaper later on in 1920. The pamphlet in which this advertisement appears does more, though, than just illustrate the radicalizing effects of crisis on Hoffmann and the speed with which he embraced anti-Semitism and radical right-wing activity. It also embodies Hoffmann's active role in shaping and strengthening that anti-Semitism by putting it in print and selling thousands of copies. In doing so, Hoffmann helped create a receptive audience for Hitler well before he was appointed chancellor in 1933. When Hoffmann decided to join the Nazi Party in April 1920, it was therefore not, as he would claim in court after the war, only out of the opportunity to make money from making portraits of Hitler. It was first and foremost a political choice, a choice that had everything to do with an anti-Semitic tradition that Hoffmann and others leveraged and refashioned during the years of war and revolution in Germany. Referring to joining the Nazi Party, Hoffmann wrote in his memoirs, quote, "At the time, its program seemed to offer the only possible solution to the chaotic problems with which my country was overwhelmed," end quote. Part of that solution was the aim of creating a world without Jews, one that Hoffmann very much endorsed, and as we can see here, helped propagate. Had the Weimar Republic faced no further problems in the years to come, perhaps Hoffmann, Hitler, and the other founding members of the Nazi Party would have remained nobodies. But that is not what happened, and many more people would follow Hoffmann's example in the years to come, as additional crises accumulated and democracy was left to die undefended. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions now.
Wow. Thank you so much, Julie. You know, this is really the value of a series like this, which has such a diversity of scholars. So you've shown us, not only have you zeroed in on a specific case that really, I think, gives people the detail that they need sometimes to put a face and an era to these larger concepts that we've been discussing up till now. But it's also just really lovely that you invoked Michael Brenner and his book and his research, and that we see this sort of real family of scholars really that AU is home to, who can look at so many different sides of the same issue and also inspire each other. So that was really sort of heartwarming, despite the chilling subject that you cover. So we have one question in the Q&A now. I hope that while Dr. Keresztes is addressing that question, that more of you will write questions. Remember, into the Q&A, not into the chat. So we have apparently a very very well informed person writing in here. Mark Burnkoff writes in that he has read suggestions that Hoffmann had superimposed Hitler's face on a 1914 Munich crowd scene. I see that you're familiar with this theory, and that there's some controversy about whether this particular photo from August of 1914 in Munich what indeed had a young Hitler in the photo or not.
Mm. Yes. Well, first, thank you for those kind words, Lauren. Very, very nice of you to say. Mark, it's a great question and an excellent point. So for those of you who may not know the photograph that Mark is referring to, Hoffmann, as you could see in some of the examples I showed from the August 1914 crowds that he photographed, also took pictures of a particular crowd scene that later he and Hitler purported to have shown Hitler in the crowd. And from then on, that photograph has been invoked in various ways, but invoked to show the kind of face of Hitler in the crowd that day. I'll point out that this so-called discovery for Hoffmann and Hitler, despite having known each other since 1919, did not take place, very conveniently, until the 1932 presidential election year. And so very much was taking place at a time when this kind of symbolic nationalism and patriotism that such a photograph would have meant would have been very politically expedient for Hitler at the time. So the debate about the photograph is whether or not it really does show Hitler in the crowd, or whether Hoffmann doctored it to place someone who looks like Hitler in the crowd and then contribute to the sort of idea that he was there that day. He may well have been there that day, and he may well have been in the photograph, but I think there's a pretty persuasive case to be made for the camp of scholars who question its authenticity. And there's a couple of really good reasons for them to do this. A lot of scholars cite the fact that in this picture allegedly from 1914, Hitler looks how he looked in the 1930s. And in 1914, in the summer of 1914, he did not have the short clipped mustache that he would later adapt after the war. Before the war, they say, he kept his mustache much longer in style, and therefore it could not be him in the photo. There's a couple of other reasons that I found while researching this book myself that make it possible and perhaps likely that this is simply a work of propaganda. One is that Hoffmann actually had expertise in retouching mustaches. He learned how to do that during the German Empire at a studio that specialized in soldier portraits, and he therefore was very good at rendering a face with a particular kind of mustache based on how the client wanted it to look. So he was very adept at this kind of doctoring and editing of photographs. And the other thing that I've come across as well is that actually in these crowds in Munich, in the pictures that Hoffmann made showing these kinds of crowds, there are quite a lot of men who loosely resemble Hitler, as well as have very similar facial hair to the mustache he would later adapt. And so it is entirely possible that, you know, the man identified as Hitler might in fact just be someone who looks like him, but that this was very convenient for the Nazis as they embarked on that propaganda campaign in 1932. And I suppose a last reason for doubting its authenticity is the sheer fact that this was a photo defined and managed by the Nazis themselves. Hoffmann, of course, was a very adept propagandist, and the fact that this narrative emerged from their own people should automatically raise doubts about what it really shows.
Yeah, what's going through my mind, of course, is what's old is new again.
Mhm.
It's apparently the concerns that we all have about how AI can be used to doctor the truth is not, it's definitely not a new concern. Just maybe just the technology changes. And
Mm. Mhm.
hopefully the kind of sophisticated analysis that you're bringing to it can also be adapted to new technologies as well. So now, of course, all the questions are rolling in. Everyone, this happens every week. People wait. So we have a couple of questions, actually, about something that you really piqued people's interest, including mine, about Hoffmann post-war. Someone
Mhm.
notes that he lived until 1957, and someone else is picking up on your brief mention of his testimony after the war. And when you said that, I also thought, huh, that's kind of strange. That's not what you usually hear about in terms of
Mhm.
prominent Nazi post-war testimony. So can you say a few words about what happened to him for the
Yeah,
remaining
yeah,
12 years of his
absolutely.
life?
Yeah, it's a fascinating period, certainly for Hoffman. I'm glad people noticed that I said that and that he lived until 1957. So Hoffman was involved in a couple of post-war crimes trials. He, for one thing, helped organize his entire photographic archive for use as evidence during trials such as Nuremberg and others. So he, made various deals with the Allied powers to be useful to them in that way, and certainly to avoid further prosecution himself in his own right. He was eventually sentenced and convicted by the denazification courts in Munich for his role, first of all, as Hitler's close confidant and friend, and also for his involvement in art plundering. He had a massive art collection, much of which had been stolen from Jewish owners, families, and collectors, and so was condemned really as a war profiteer for that role. And in the 50s, did serve some prison time as well as various other stints before that in jail, and eventually had much of his wealth confiscated from him as well by the authority of the Munich denazification courts. So he did encounter some, legal punishment for his role in general in the Third Reich, but also specifically his participation in art theft and art plundering. I would argue actually that the full scope of his involvement in Nazi crimes has yet to be uncovered, and that is certainly part of my aim with this book, is to reveal that full extent beyond what prosecutors in the immediate aftermath of World War II knew. He wrote this memoir that I cite in the 1950s, and in part because of the years that he wrote it, it has to be approached very cautiously. Sometimes it's still cited today as kind of impartial, objective evidence. But at the time, Hoffmann was trying very hard to clear his name, to get his wealth back, his personal fortune back, and to try to fashion himself as just a photographer, as a sort of apolitical photographer. And so he tried very hard in the last years of his life to do that until he died in 1957.
Well, he certainly was an opportunist, and he also had, he had what in Yiddish and Hebrew you would say chutzpah, like, using his own photo archive that he created because he was so close with the Nazi leadership to then comply with the Allies during Nuremberg while his former friends and colleagues were being convicted is a very creative use of his own resources, shall we say.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
there are a number of questions, and I was wondering about this too, regarding various artists and photographers, filmmakers, and one person is wondering, which is a great question, to whether he had any effect on any influence on Leni Riefenstahl. And somebody else is wondering whether there's any connection between his work and anti-Hitler photo montage artists, such as John Hartfield, who was originally German. And I was wondering actually about the role of the artist writ large and how he fits into that, and also these other people who others asked about. Uh, I think that it's a popular but often incorrect assumption that someone who is creative, someone who is an artist, is going to be, more progressive automatically and stand for individual rights and, for all that is good and true, etc. And
Mm,
and I think that he may be another powerful example of the most famous of these sort of pro-fascist artists, and that would be, of course, Richard Wagner.
mm,
And together these people, not the anti-Hitler artist who was mentioned, but like is Hoffman part of a type,
hmm.
you think?
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. I think Hoffman is very much a particular type of Nazi that I think crosses the boundaries of the artists. I think they're even beyond the realm of art. You can certainly see a particular type of personality that views the Nazis and the Nazi Party as an opportunity for wealth, for profit, for social power, for political power. And so I definitely see Hoffman as firmly within that literature, the long-term literature on particular Nazi types and Nazi personalities. As far as the specific question of artists, he certainly belongs to the realm of various artists who propagated the image of the Nazi Party, who helped it into power, who helped it maintain power. Leni Riefenstahl is the most familiar example, and there are others as well. Riefenstahl and Hoffman didn't know each other, but I have yet to find much evidence of a sort of mutual influence. It seems that the realm of film and the realm of the propaganda photography, the still photography that he presided over, as far as I can tell, was largely kept separate. But of course, they did know each other. And there was certainly a degree of competition as well, as artists kind of seeking to achieve favor with Hitler, and to achieve the kind of power and status that they both hungered for. Um, the point about John Hertfield is an interesting one. I have seen some of his collages, some of his anti-Nazi collages that do actually repurpose some of Hoffmann's photographs for an anti-Nazi message, which is absolutely fascinating. And so in that sense, there's this whole realm of work in the realm of art that operates on both sides of things. And for Hoffmann, I think I ultimately see him as a part of that world, but also as a part of these worlds outside of art, the political worlds, the sort of worlds of Goebbels and Speer and all these other high-ranking familiar personalities, in part because they all invoked similar things about their Nazi past. They all claimed to have been following orders. They all claimed that they didn't know the full extent of the Holocaust, and so on and so on. So he is very much firmly a part of both dimensions of this history.
We are almost out of time, but you mentioned some of them, and some of the leaders of the Nazi Party, and we don't have time for all of the specific individuals, but one person poses, to bring us back to kind of the central figure, poses the question: was Adolf Hitler influenced by Hoffmann in any way? Was there reciprocal influence, or specifically was Hitler inspired by the fact that Hoffmann had such faith in him?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. There's actually a new or a recent biography of Hitler that I think would be useful for whoever, and I can't quite see who asked the question, but for whoever asked the question, the biography on Hitler by Volker Ulrich, which came out a couple of years ago, might be the thing to turn to for this question. And that is in part because Ulrich really emphasizes the view that, in contrast to previous studies on him, Hitler really did have quite an active social life. Previous interpretations kind of preferred to view him as a loner, a sort of asocial, sort of disturbed individual with no friends or family. But Ulrich revises this view to kind of show just how embedded Hitler was in various families, and Hoffmann's family was one of them. Hoffmann really at various times was more than a friend to Hitler. He was sort of a member of the Hoffmann family. And that influence, I think, did shape the kind of dictator that Hitler became, as well as the sort of staying power of the Nazi movement itself. Hoffmann certainly shaped the popular image of Hitler in the press, in photographs, in propaganda. And certainly those items too influenced Hitler and reinforced his own belief that he would be this so-called savior of Germany. And so there was absolutely, I think, operating on a couple of different levels, a mutual influence there. One on the sort of social level, the emotional kind of friendship and familial level that the Hoffmann family provided for him. And then as well on the sort of political and ideological level as well. I think there's definitely a mutual influence there. And you may have noticed in the very first slide that I showed, that photograph of Hoffmann from the 1920s was taken by Eva Braun, who would become Hitler's wife. Eva Braun worked in Hoffmann's photography studio, and it was Hoffmann who introduced her to Hitler. So there's all sorts of ways in which
Wow.
influence operated, but especially, I think, in the realm of the social and the political.
Right, right. And you hear that with other figures as well. Well, all I can say is I think not only are we excited that your first book is coming out, but we're already excited for this second book, this biography, because this has been really fascinating. Thank you all for joining us yet again. And we will see you next week when actually I'm giving a lecture. And so Pam Nadell will be introducing and moderating. We're switching roles. So everybody have a good week. Thank you again to Julie. That was really, really fascinating.
Thank you, Lauren.